Hey you folks, Quill18 here, and welcome to another episode of our Guide to Kerbal Space Program for Complete Beginners. And today we are going to cover getting to orbit. And this is by far the trickiest thing for a new player to Kerbal Space Program to do. It is the sort of thing that once you've done it a few times, it really becomes easy and second nature and almost kind of just routine and trivial, especially as you unlock new technologies, which will make it a lot easier for you to get a ship into orbit with lots of fuel left over to do something exciting, like go to the moon, for example. Now, there's going to be a little bit of theory that we're going to deal with first. We're going to start with a little bit of theory about, what is an orbit and how to get to orbit. It's going to involve some Photoshop type drawing, and then we're going to switch back into here to build the ship. So, we're going to do that now. If you want to skip it, well, feel free, but I think you might find it semi-valuable. So, over here, we have a lovely diagram showing Kerbin, our planet here, and a blue line that represents a path very similar to what we've done before with our launching of our ship and then coming back down at an angle, right? Now, we've talked before in the last episode, we talked about why it might be bad to go, say, straight up. Can I not draw on this frame? Hello? Oh, that's not my brush. This is the brush. There we go. Going straight up and then coming straight down is quite bad because you might come down so fast and not have enough air beneath you. But it's even more important to go up at an angle when we're talking about orbits, because ultimately, getting to space is quite easy. We did it before, and we did it with very little. Reaching the edge of space over here, where the air stops, is very easy. And then we come right back down. The hard part is staying in space, because staying in space is not just a matter of going up more, or going up even more. None of these things help you get to orbit. What you have to do ultimately to stay in orbit is to go sideways very fast, because what you're trying to do is make it so that instead of falling down here, or falling down here, or even falling down over here, you're trying to make it so that you fall down over here, and fall down over here, and fall down over here, and fall down over here. Being in orbit does not mean you are not affected by gravity. In fact, as it turns out, that when you are in space over here, you're still being affected by like 99% of the same gravity that you are on the ground, for example. It's just that, and we know that because if we go straight up, you know you're going to come down really fast. So clearly gravity is still a thing over here. But if you go sideways far enough, when you fall, you will constantly miss the Earth, or Kerbin in this case. And that is our goal. Now, you can't just launch in some way that instantly and magically puts you into an orbit. You will always launch in a fashion that ends you up with some sort of curve like this. It might be a little bit more narrow, it might be a little bit wider, but ultimately you end up with a curve like this, which means that you come back down to the ground at some point. What you have to do is you have to do one more maneuver, and you're going to be doing this at the top of your arc, okay? The reason is, what you have already, what you've got here with your launch and then what's going to be your landing, you actually already have a circle. It's not an arc, it's actually a circle, but you can't see all of it because most of the circle is underneath the ground over here, and it's invisible. What your goal is to orbit is your goal is to take this circle and make it so big, make this circle so big. Hold on, I need to make sure that the anchor point is set over there to demonstrate properly. Is so big like this that it pops out the other side of the planet and ends up high enough that the lowest point in the circle, right? So if we do this, then this is the lowest point in the circle, this is the highest point, this is the lowest point. Those concepts are going to be very important soon. You want the lowest point in your circle to be high enough that it's above 70 kilometers, which means it's outside of the atmosphere. Because if at any point in this circle it goes so low that you hit the air, you're going to slow down, and eventually you're not going to be in orbit anymore. Eventually you're going to be landed one way or another because the air will keep slowing you down. So our goal is to end up with a circle that is all 70 kilometers above the surface of the ground by the time you're all said and done. Now, I will say this. The interesting thing is, the only reason we have to go up at all... How come I can't just undo this? There we go. The only reason you have to go up at all when you take off is just to get out of the air. If we were on something like the moon, which has no atmosphere whatsoever, right? Then the best way for you to reach orbit would actually be to take off completely sideways, because that would end you up with a circle that is almost orbital to start off with. You are still at whatever your highest point is, you're still going to have to do something that will cause the circle to grow into a proper orbit of some kind. But if you were on the moon, you would only ever have to go high enough so that you're higher up than any of the mountains, so that when you go sideways, you don't smack into a mountain. That would be your only goal. On Kerbal, it's a little bit more work because we have to go up high enough so that we don't smack into any air. That is our goal over here. Now, one thing, I think is this going to be the last part of a theory? Almost. One thing we're not going to want to do is go straight up and then turn and burn sideways. The reason we don't want to do this is, well, it's actually quite simple. What we don't want is, it's the park problem, right? Let me go and do a little demo here. Let's say you were trying to cross a park, okay? So this is a park over here. You are in the bottom corner of the park, and you want to get to the top corner over here. What you could do is you could walk over this way, and then walk over that way. Now, if this side of the park is 1 kilometer, and this side of the park is 1 kilometer, then you will have walked 2 kilometers. However, if what you do is you cross the park diagonally, then you won't walk as far. You'll be walking, what, the square root of 2, which is, I want to say 1.4? Question mark? Something like that. But no matter what, you will have walked less than 2 kilometers if you just go diagonally. And that's exactly what we're trying to do over here. If we go straight up and then burn sideways, we are doing that walking around the park. Instead, what we want to do is we want, as much as possible, to go diagonally over here, because what we want to do is minimize that sort of distance, and we end up in exactly the same kind of place, okay? Now, we don't want to actually take off from the ground at this angle. The reason we don't want to take off from the ground at this angle is twofold. First of all, if we literally just set our spaceship like sideways like that, what would happen is we'd sort of probably end up flopping over like that, and bad things would happen. It is much easier, it is much better to control your spaceship, generally speaking, to take off straight up until you reach a certain speed, and then there's sort of like aerodynamic stability that starts to happen and whatever. But that's only a small part of it. The real reason you take off with your spaceship mostly pointing upwards is because the air on the ground of Kerbal is very thick. You know, at sea level, up to about, I don't know, 10-ish kilometers or something like that, the air is very, very, very thick. The longer your spaceship spends in that thick, thick air, the more speed you're going to lose just from aerodynamic drag. The air is so thick, it slows you down. So what we want to do is kind of split the difference in a weird way. We know our goal is to go as sideways as possible, but we can't go sideways that much right from the start. As such, we end up taking off straight up, and then we start to turn a little bit. As the air thins out, we turn more and more and more and more. There's a couple of different reasons for doing this structure, you know, gravity drag and all kind. I like to really think about it as you go up vertically through the thickest part of the air so you can leave the thick air behind as quickly as possible, and then you work your way to turn over to the side, because ultimately this is the direction we want to end up in. When you are in orbit, think about it. When you are in orbit and you've defined your full circle, at any point in your orbit, what direction are you moving in? You're always going to be moving perpendicular to the ground, sideways to the ground. All right, I think that's all the theory. There's one more bit I want to talk about, going back to our little blue circle over here. Oop, not that one. This is the blue circle. I'm really confused. You. Excellent. One more thing I want to talk about with this circle is the idea that this circle, the path defined by this circle, the size of the circle depends on how much energy is into your orbit. If you add more energy to your orbit, the circle gets bigger. If you take energy away from this, the circle gets smaller, okay? Keep that idea. Or if you add more speed to the circle, it gets bigger. And if you take speed away from the circle, it gets smaller. And the way we're going to do that is by burning, by lighting our engine and burning our engine in a particular direction to add speed. So we're going to take off and we're going to be moving leftwards, okay? There's going to be a really good reason for that. I guess I could explain it now. If we are looking down, so this is the North Pole. We are looking down onto the North Pole of the planet, which means that this way is east, okay? East. Or from the bottom, right? East. Like that, if we're looking down on the North Pole of the planet. That happens to be the direction that the planet is rotating in. The planet, it rotates like this, which means if we take off going east, what happens is the natural rotation of the planet is giving us a kickstart. A really substantial kickstart. It is much, much harder and takes a lot more fuel to travel west instead. Much more work because you have to first cancel out the natural rotation of the planet and then add in that much more just so that you can break even with what happens if you take off towards the east. So we're going to take off to the east because it gives us a little bit of a boost, okay? Yeah, so anyway, so we're always going to be traveling in this direction over here. And on your Navball, we've talked about that circle, that prograde marker, which is sort of like a yellowy, maybe green. I see it as a yellow. Some people call it green. It's the circle like this that's got the two wings that come out the side and the top circle over there. On your Navball, that circle represents the direction you're currently moving in. Therefore, the way we add energy to this system is if, especially right over here, ideally here, you can do it anywhere. Actually, that's something I should mention in a second. Okay, let's say you're here and you're facing the prograde marker, that one over here. So your orangey little, like, I don't remember exactly the way it's shaped. Is it like something like this? Something like that. But the orangey thing with the little yellow dot, that's more like from the bottom, right? Anyway, is in the middle of the prograde marker, and you light your engines. What you are going to be doing is you're going to be adding energy to this circle and causing it to grow. The opposite side, if you were to point towards your retrograde marker. The retrograde marker is the same color as the prograde marker, which is that sort of greenish yellow. It's the same color like that, and it still has the top little, like, rudder bit, but instead the wings are broken or pointing down. That's the way I think of this. This is like an airplane with wings, which means you're going, I think of it that way. But if the wings are down, if the wings are broken, that means you're pointing backwards. If you point your ship towards retrograde, and you're pointing backwards, and then you light your engines, what you are doing at that point is you're taking energy away from the system and making your circle smaller. Now you'll notice that this spot here, where you are, that's where I keep putting that little anchor point here, you're growing from out of that. You're either shrinking from out of that location or growing from out of that location. And that is always true. Wherever you are now, that doesn't change. That spot in your orbit will not change if that's where you're doing the burn from. All you're doing is changing the rest of the orbit. In particular, you can think of this very much as pushing out the opposite side. Wherever you are here, if you burn prograde, you're taking that spot, the opposite side of your orbit, and pushing it outwards and upwards. Or if you burn retrograde, you are again taking the opposite side of your orbit and bringing it in. You're shrinking the circle or lowering that part of your orbit over here. At any given point, the highest point in your orbit is known as the apoapsis, which is marked as an AP, and the lowest point is marked is known as your periapsis, which is marked with a PE. So, whoops. So in this case over here, right, like this, this is the highest point in our orbit. This would be the apoapsis. This is the lowest point in our orbit, which would be the periapsis. But if we keep burning here, what's going to happen is we keep raising the opposite point, and at some point over here, suddenly, this is now, even though we haven't actually changed anything about this spot, this is now the lowest part in our orbit because we've pushed out the other side so much. This becomes the periapsis. This becomes the apoapsis. It's important to note that at some point, these two sides, the apoapsis and periapsis, they swap. This is the lowest point, all of a sudden it's the highest point. This is the highest point, all of a sudden it's the lowest point. At some point in doing this, they will swap. Okay, with all that, I think we've gotten all the sort of orbital mechanics out of the way. and we can go ahead and start designing our ship. There is one more technical thing that we're going to talk about as we build our ship, but we can wait a little bit for that. We're going to double check mission control. Again, there's many contracts in here. I only have one that I have active right now, which is to orbit Kerbal. That will be my sole goal for this particular mission. In fact, I'm not even going to be bringing science with us because I want to keep this as dead simple as possible. However, you will probably want to still continue to acquire much science as you go forward. And again, you can get science from these extra biomes over here. You can get science from the highlands and the mountains over here if you want. And as usual, if you spend your science to unlock more science, you can get more science experiments like the Science Junior, which allows you to keep getting the science over and over. Also, remember that you can repeat any one science experiment in any different biome. So you can do a crew report from the launch pad, one from the runway, one from the highlands, one from the shores. Same thing with Mystery Goo, same thing with everything, and including lower atmosphere, upper atmosphere, and finally in space. You don't actually have to be in real orbit to do science from space, but it is a little bit more convenient because you have a little bit more time to plan things. Now, I have some science. I don't know how much you've got. Maybe you've done exactly the same thing I have, therefore you have as much science as I do. However, I don't know 100% what you've got, and I actually want to show how little you need to go into orbit. Now, technically, we can go into orbit with what we've got here. I've done a test and confirmed that you can do it, but it's really, really tight margins to get to orbit with exactly what we have unlocked so far. So I am going to go ahead and unlock one more tech, which is general rocketry over here. And the main reason I am unlocking this is because it will give us a new fuel tank that is simply twice as big as the old fuel tank. It's twice the weight, twice the capacity. It's basically the same. We could use two FLT-100 fuel tanks to do the same as a single FLT-200 fuel tank. There is no advantage to the latter, except that we currently have a 30-part limit for our spaceship. So if we can use fewer parts, then it gives us a little bit more room to work. It's also going to give me a cool opportunity to talk about the difference between a couple of different engines. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock this technology, General Rocketry, which only costs 20 science, leaving us with plenty left over. In practice, I will say this, you will probably want, your getting to orbit is much easier if you were to also unlock Advanced Rocketry. And the reason for that is Advanced Rocketry gives you the Terrier liquid fuel engine. This engine is not very powerful, but it's super fuel efficient in space, which means you can use this as a final stage in a really efficient way. We'll talk about that later, but I'm going to only pick up General Rocketry, and we're going to build our orbiter with just this technology. All right, so we're going to go ahead and leave the facility. The other thing that can make your life much easier is if you upgrade your launch pad. If you right-click on your launch pad, right now your launch pad has a weight limit of 18 tons. If you were to spend 50,000 Kerbal bucks, you could upgrade your launch pad to give you a maximum weight of 140. So from 18 to 140, you also get a lot more leeway towards your max vessel size. The other thing that could make your life a little bit easier is upgrading the vehicle assembly building. This is considerably more expensive. You might have to run some contracts to be able to guarantee that you have enough money for everything, but this will increase your part limit from 30 to 255. Still, we don't actually need that. It makes your life easier. It lets you build more powerful vessels, which will have an easier time reaching orbit with a bigger margin, but we don't actually need that. So, in the vehicle assembly building, we're going to start assembling our ship. So, we are definitely going to start with the Mark 1 command pod. We are still going to add a parachute to the Mark 1 command pod so that we can bring Jebediah or Valentina home. We are then going to still add a heat shield underneath the command pod, and this is everything that's going to be coming home. Again, you may, especially if you've upgraded your VAB so you've got a higher part limit, you might want to stick some experiments on here, especially if there's something that you haven't done, but I am not going to be running any science on this mission. We are obviously going to need a decoupler underneath this so that we can still drop off our ascent stage. So go into coupling, grab the TR-18A stack decoupler, and put that down there. That ensures that we come home with just this pod and nothing else. So now we have to develop our ascent. Now, we talked about before the idea, let me go and just say stick a few fuel tanks on here, okay? We've talked a little bit about the idea of thrust. If we look at our swivel liquid engine over here, it has a thrust at sea level, right? Thrust at sea level of, let's call it 170 kilonewtons. And furthermore, our ship has a weight right now of about 6 tons, And the force of gravity on Kerbal, just like on Earth, is 9.8 meters per second, although we said we'd round that to 10. Let's pretend the force of gravity is 10. The weight of this ship is 6. 6 times 10 is 60. 60 kilonewtons is how much gravity is pulling down on our ship. Gravity is pulling down on our ship with 60 kilonewtons. Our engine is pushing us up at 170. 170 is clearly bigger than 60, therefore we will go up. Now, if, and again, this is a little bit of a repeat from before, but bear with me here. If our ship was weighed, say, 17 tons, which means gravity was pulling down on us at about a strength of 170 kilonewtons, which would be about the same as the strength of this liquid fuel engine, then clearly we wouldn't go anywhere. We'd be breaking even, we'd be sort of hovering, and nothing would happen, which would be bad. It also wouldn't be very helpful if gravity was only slightly less than our engine, because then we'd be spending about 99% of our fuel canceling out gravity, and only 1% of it going up. So clearly, that's not great either. We want to make sure that we have a fair bit more thrust than the force of gravity. The question is, how much? Right now, we have a lot more thrust. Again, we have 170 kilonewtons, and this ship here would be getting pulled down by about 60. So we have almost a 3-to-1. Not quite, but almost a 3-to-1 ratio of the thrust to gravity over here, or kind of a 300%, I guess you would say, thrust to mass ratio. Is that enough? Is it too much? Is it not enough? Well, this is the sort of thing that you will sort of like develop over time, get a sense of. But it is so much here. It is so powerful that while that's good and we will go up quickly, it really means we have more room on the ship for more fuel. Because here's the thing you have to remember. Your thrust to weight ratio tells you how fast you will accelerate, but it doesn't tell you how far you will go. Imagine the situation where you have two cars. They both have a fuel tank that is exactly the same size. One of the cars is a insane supercar with like a V12 engine that goes from 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, and it's being driven by Jeremy Clarkson, who just wants power, right? When he goes, he's going to put the pedal to the metal. He's going to accelerate really fast. He's going to hit an insanely high top speed, and he's going to go about 10 miles, and then the car will run out of gas because that giant engine is built for power and raw acceleration, but not fuel efficiency. Whereas next to him is a little hybrid car with a really efficient engine. It's only got a top speed of 100 kilometers an hour. It can't go very fast at all, but it is so fuel efficient that it will be able to cross the entirety of Europe on a single tank of gas. Even though they had the same fuel tank to start off with. That's the difference between an engine that is powerful, or one that has very, very high thrust, and one that is very fuel efficient. Now, we are just going to be using one engine throughout over here, the swivel. But when we're talking about the balance between how much fuel we bring versus thrust, that discussion becomes important. We need just enough thrust that we move upwards at a comfortable rate, and that we don't feel that we're wasting 99% of our fuel canceling out gravity. So in practice, what you try to target is probably something like your thrust should be higher than the force of gravity by maybe about 25-ish%. Somewhere around there, maybe a little bit more than that, depending on your shape and different things like that. As long as you've got at least about 25% more thrust than the weight of your ship, you're in really, really good shape, and therefore, usually the best way that you will go further is to add more fuel. There's whole discussions about delta V that is probably outside the scope of this particular tutorial, and a lot of the straight up delta V math mostly comes into play once you're already in orbit. But that is going to be our goal. We want to go and add as much fuel as we can while still feeling comfortable with our oomph. And with 170 kilonewtons of thrust, I'm going to say that we can have a weight of 13, maybe 14 tons and still be happy. So if I go and if I click on the top fuel tank, I will just rip the whole thing apart. If I hold Alt and click on the top fuel tank, it will copy. So let me do that and maybe add a little bit more. And just to say, what do we end up with over here? we end up with a ship. Here we're sitting at about 13 tons. So, like, we're kind of getting close to the ballpark over here. Now, there's a slight issue with this ship in terms of getting to orbit. Because, again, getting to orbit is all about your mass, managing your weight versus your fuel. As we go and we launch and we start burning fuel, what's going to happen? These fuel tanks are going to start to empty and empty and empty. Now, as these fuel tanks empty, our ship gets lighter because the weight of the fuel is calculated into your ship. So our ship will get lighter and we'll go faster. And hey, that's great. But you start to realize by the time we get sort of down here and we only have 3 fuel tanks of fuel left, we're still hauling all these empty fuel tanks to space. Okay? We're still hauling all these things to space, and they have weight. Yeah, not as much as when they're full of fuel, but they're still heavy, and therefore, we're spending a ton of our energy hauling empty fuel tanks to space. And that feels pretty stupid to me. And indeed, that is true. Now, adding more engines to a ship. Let's say I went and did something like this, right? Adding more engines to a ship will give you more thrust. You will accelerate faster. But quite frequently, doing something like this will not let you go further. What you're doing here is you're building your supercar instead of your really efficient hybrid, I don't know, Prius or whatever. And what we're looking for almost always is we're looking for something that gives us more distance, more change in velocity actually, but let's call it for this purpose, more distance as opposed to just more raw speed. So adding more engines is often a bad thing. And why is that? While it gives you more thrust, engines have weight. Adding an engine, these swivel engines weigh 1.5 tons. That is 1.5 tons that is not fuel. The only time you want to add more engines is when you need more thrust. If you don't have enough thrust to take off from the launch pad, then that's a situation for adding more engines. But generally, adding more engines means you don't go quite as far, with caveats for gravity drag, which we're not really going to get into over here. But anyway, that being said, there is a case where adding more engines does make you go further, but it might be somewhat counterintuitive. What we're going to do is I'm going to grab this fuel tank over here. I'm just going to set it aside. I'm going to add another swivel engine here. Then I'm going to go ahead and add another decoupler underneath that. And then I'm going to put this stage back in. And what have we ended up with here? We've added another engine. And that engine is adding an extra 1.5 tons of weight to our ship. But I've actually added it in a way that it's not even going to help us on takeoff. Why would I do that? Well, the reason I'm going to do that is because when we take off, we're going to burn with this engine. And yeah, this engine's going to be working a little bit harder because it's got to lift an extra 1.5 tons. And, so that it's a little harder. Our ship's a little heavier at 14.5 tons now. But at some point, when these 6 fuel tanks are empty, we're going to be able to decouple over here and drop this stage away. And then we end up with, it's the same swivel engine, same stats, but this is a swivel engine that's not having to carry a whole bunch of empty fuel tanks to space. Even though this design adds 1.5 tons of dead weight at takeoff, this design will go much further, i.e. have a bigger change in velocity, bigger delta V. This design will go further and therefore will get to orbit a lot better than if we didn't have the extra engine. Now this is where that Terrier engine I was talking about a minute ago, the Terrier engine is a really good fit for this stage because it's not quite as powerful. It's only got a thrust strength of something like 60 kilonewtons. In fact, and I think it's only like 18 at the surface. The Terrier is really bad in the atmosphere, but it's not bad in space. 60 kilonewtons isn't as powerful, but once you're sort of in space and in orbit, you don't need as much raw thrust as before because even though gravity's still there, you're not really working to cancel gravity anymore, so having less thrust isn't a problem. But the important thing about the Terrier is it's really fuel efficient. It delivers the thrust that it does by using up a lot less fuel than the swivel one does. And the Terrier is also a lot lighter. I think the Terrier weighs half a ton instead of 1.5 tons. So it saves a lot of weight and becomes a lot more efficient. But you want to make sure the Terrier is only ever going to be used in space, or maybe the very, very high atmosphere where there's very little air anyway. Otherwise, you're not really gaining advantage of it. But we don't have access to it, so we're going to go with something kind of like this. Now, your balance of fuel tanks at the top versus bottom, you can experiment with different things. Generally speaking, you want less up here than below. And anyway, so we're in this kind of situation. That's not bad. We've only used 16 parts. We are almost certainly going to want maybe a few basic fins. Now, I'm going to go, and I'm going to be in this triple symmetry over here. 3 fins is actually all you need to get the entire job done, because it doesn't matter. I guess I can't actually see the fin. That's kind of annoying. Whether you're going left, right, or backwards and forward, there's still going to be a surface there going to work. So 3 fins is just as good as 4 fins, and is slightly lighter and slightly cheaper, so that's good. Now, at this point, if we were to take off now, I'm just a little bit worried, because our ship's a little bit heavier, that we might be spending just a little bit too much of our fuel getting ourselves moving in the first place. And I would like to give us a little bit more of a kick to take off. When you're thinking about wanting a little bit more kick to take off, that's where solid rocket boosters excel. Solid rocket boosters are a great example of those supercar situations. They give you a lot of kick it's really cheap actually, but they don't burn very long, right? They're just about sort of raw acceleration, and then you dismiss them. And I think it would be a great idea for us to kick things off with a Hammer solid fuel booster, because you can see that its max thrust is around 200 kilonewtons, so it's going to be quite good at lifting, giving us an initial go over here. Now, there are a lot of guides online that recommend not exceeding somewhere around 300 meters per second, at least in the early phases of your takeoff, and there may or may not be different arguments to be said about that. The reason for it is, in thick atmosphere, once you exceed about 300 meters per second, you're going to run into supersonic forces and lots of air drag that might slow you down. I'm sort of going off on a tangent here, but anyway, the point is that the Hammer will probably speed us up to around there, and then sort of like run out of juice and kick off. It should time out really nicely. Anyway, yeah, I'm sorry about that. Let's get back to building the ship. So let's add another stage over here. We're going to want a Hammer underneath all this. So we're going to need another decoupler. Boop. And then we're going to go ahead and throw a Hammer down there. Like that. Excellent. Oh, almost excellent. We are actually slightly overweight. Again, because I did not go and upgrade my launch pad, I have a weight limit of 18 tons. This ship is going to weigh 18.1 tons. So I'm going to go ahead and shave just a little bit of weight off. What I'm going to do is grab one of these fuel tanks. Let me grab this fuel tank over here, and I'm just going to replace it with the FLT 100 fuel tank. So it's just half the amount of fuel in this top stage. It brings us to a weight of 17.54, so we are good. Note, I'm not putting my fins down at the bottom of this SRB. Normally, you want your fins as low as possible. You want your spaceship to look like a dart. But this SRB isn't going to be around very long, and once it's gone, I want the fins on this stage over here. So I think that's going to be a perfectly happy medium. What you don't want your fins up top, because that will cause your ship to flip upside down. Anyway, I'm pretty sure we can use this to get to orbit. Again, if you've got a higher part budget and you want to do more, add some science, add some variety, but I'm just going to show this very minimal little ship. We want to guarantee that we complete the orbit contract. So we're going to take a look at our staging. First stage is going to be light this engine. We actually do have to fix our engine staging here. There we go. So first stage is going to be light the SRB, then we drop the SRB, then we light the next engine, then we drop the ascent stage, light the orbiter engine, then at some point we drop all the fuel tanks, and we parachute back home. That's looking okay. We're going to make a slight change, though, to this. Here's the thing. There's going to be, when we hit the spacebar, it's going to drop this stage, and then we have to hit the spacebar again to light this engine. It's kind of bad if during our ascent we spend any time without any engines burning, because we're going to rely on especially these swivel engines to give us the ability to steer our ship, and in particular, if you stop accelerating, then it gives the aerodynamic forces a chance to flip your ship out and make it go in all sorts of directions. So we want to avoid not having an engine going, and so what we're going to do is this. I'm going to take this stage, number 4, which is this engine, and I'm going to combine it with the decoupler beneath it. So what's going to happen here is when we hit the space bar to drop off the stage, it's going to decouple and instantly light this next engine. And we're going to do the same thing with this stage over here. We're going to instantly decouple and light this engine in one go. So that way we don't have any kind of dead time where the engines aren't burning. But other than that, I'm pretty happy. Who's going to be in driver's seat for this? I guess we can leave Jebediah in there. That's going to be A-okay. All right, let us go. So, again, remember that what we're going to try to do here is we are going to try to go, we're going to start by going upward because we're trying to leave the thick air as quickly as possible. But at some point, we need to make sure we turn to the east. Again, we want to turn towards the east because that's the way the planet's already rotating, so we get a kickstart from doing that. The general rule of thumb that people use is they tend to accelerate upwards until they hit about 100 meters per second over here, at which point they manually turn over to about 10 degrees to the east. 10 degrees is this first sort of circle over here on the Navball. And in fact, one of the things is when you are piloting your ship, you spend very little time looking at your ship. You spend almost all of your time looking at the Navball over here. So we're going to be taking off. When this hits about 100 meters per second, we're going to start hitting the D key, which is going to turn us towards the east. The east is over here. See, 90 degrees is east. This is, north is down here. South is up here. West is over here. So we're going to be going towards the east, and that's the D key to go over here. Don't be confused, because your camera can be pointing in any way possible, but your WASD, how come we're slightly twisted, which is odd. Huh. But your WASD keys control based on your Navball over here. So that's, stare at your Navball and you won't be too confused. So we'll be tapping the D key to try to move over to 10 degrees. Then, as we continue to ascend, we want to go further and further towards the right. At some point, we're going to end up pointing directly towards the horizon over here. But we want to do that over time. At what rate do we want to do that in? It depends on your ship design, it depends on your thrust, it depends on how aerodynamic you are, and so on and so forth. A good rule of thumb, though, is you're going to be looking to hit this big circle. This big circle over here, that's the 45 degrees, like 45-degree angle to the horizon, right? So this sort of angle like this. You're still facing east, you're still facing a heading of 90 degrees. But, yeah, why is our ship crooked? I don't know, maybe it's just because we don't have the support struts over here, so, oh well, it'll be fine, probably. But yeah, we're going to be going to about 45 degrees when we hit about 15 kilometers, or 15,000 meters. That tends to be kind of a decent sweet spot. As you develop your ships, some ships will want to take off more steeply than that. The heavier and bigger and less aerodynamic your ship is, the more you're going to need to take off vertically. A more vertical path is ultimately less fuel efficient for entering orbit, but it's a lot safer and a lot easier. So sometimes you'll have to accept a less fuel efficient ascent in exchange for something that actually gets to space without exploding. Anyway, we are going to go and we're going to turn on the SAS. Again, the hotkey for that is T. We're going to set our throttle to maximum. We can do that with the Z key. So Control and Shift lets you change your throttle. Z sets max throttle. X sets to 0, so we're going to go full throttle. Note that our solid rocket booster that's starting off with, it doesn't actually have any throttle control. It ignores that, but that's going to be important for our next stage. We are going to go 100% full throttle for the whole thing. Again, if you're below 10,000 kilometers in the thicker air, depending on how aerodynamic your ship is, there's some argument for not exceeding 330 meters per second, but generally speaking, faster is just going to be better, because while you might encounter a little bit more aerodynamic drag, you'll encounter less gravity drag, so in the end, you'll probably actually come out ahead. When in doubt, full throttle. It's the Kerbal way. Anyway, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and hit spacebar to launch. So with the SAS on, Jebediah is going to try to keep us pointing the same way we're pointing. What I'm going to do, though, I'm going to use the E key here. I'm going to use E to just spin on our central axis here, just to make it so that the east is to our right again. That way I can use the D key. I mean, we could also spin more so that we could use the W key to go east, but that's going to be okay. Look at our solid fuel. It's nearly out. As soon as it runs out, and hit spacebar to stage. Excellent. So that SRB is gone, but it gave it just a little bit of extra kick, and I'm happy about it. So again, as this approaches 100 meters per second, I'm going to start delicately tapping the D key to turn towards the right over here. Notice, see the SAS icon? When you hit your arrow key, SAS is smart enough to sort of cancel and reset itself. So Jebediah tries to keep us pointing straight, but he realizes that if we're steering, then we have a new straight. that, let me hit escape for a second. See that yellow circle? That's our prograde marker that we discussed. That is the direction that our ship is traveling in. The yellow dot is, or the orange dot is the direction we're currently pointing in. These are two different things. Now, as we point in one direction, we will be dragging the prograde marker over there because we will start moving in this new direction. But it takes a little while before like that actually gets pushed. Imagine you're sliding on ice, right? You can be, you push yourself off from the wall on the ice. You're moving in one direction. If you rotate yourself so that you're facing to the side, that's not going to change which direction you're moving in. You're going to keep sliding in the same original direction. Same thing happens here until, the engine pushes us further to the side. You want to avoid going too far outside of this yellow circle because it means you will be pointing quite differently from the direction you're moving in, and that causes the air to hit your ship from the side all of a sudden, which could cause your ship to flip out or even break apart. So you want to avoid going too far outside of the yellow circle. Depending on your ship design, sometimes you desperately need to stay inside the yellow circle, and some ships can afford to go a fair bit outside the yellow circle and still be safe. It depends on your design. It also depends a lot on where you are in the atmosphere. Right now we're in the thick air, so it's very important to stay in that yellow circle. When we get into the upper atmosphere, which is very thin, then really we can pretty much ignore the yellow circle if we need to because there's not enough air to cause a problem. So we're going to keep ascending, and again, I'm going to try to stick on the right-hand side of the circle. And again, my general sort of idea is to hit this 45-degree angle when we get to about 15,000 kilometers, because that tends to describe the right kind of turn. You'll also hear the term gravity turn applied here, which is really what we're doing. Now, in a really sweet, perfect gravity turn, we actually don't have to manually steer our ship at all. It'll actually end up sort of rotating like this very gradually and naturally, but we're not quite there, so that's okay. So 11 kilometers, 12 kilometers again. I'm just tapping the D key a little bit, and I'm trying to encourage the prograde marker to nudge over to 15K. I'm going to just steer up a little bit here just to try to get us right on the east marker again. And that's pretty sweet. Look at that. We're pretty much where I kind of want to be. That's going to be excellent. So we're going to keep that going. Now, you don't have to be in this view at all. The only time you have to be in this view actually is when you need to stage. The rest of the time, it's often going to be better to be in the map view, which is what we're going to switch to in a second, which use the M key to do that. Still, I'm going to stay in this view just long enough to finish this first descent phase. You can see we're almost out of liquid fuel here, so I'm going to keep doing this. Now we're past 15K, so I'm okay with going a little bit more sideways. I'm just going to stop controlling anything for now. I'm going to wait for this liquid fuel to go, and there we go, we'll stage. Now I'm going to go into the map view over here, and I'm going to hit escape for a second. So by hitting M, we go to the map. From this screen, you can still steer your ship. However, you can only steer the ship if you expand the Navball, which is down here, okay? You need to expand this Navball, and all of a sudden you can steer the ship from this view, which is exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to hit escape to close this little pause menu. There we go, expand the Navball. And so I can still steer the ship over here, and I can keep it pointing mostly prograde. Now, if we turn the view, so we can use the right mouse button to turn over here and hit escape, you want to look down onto the North Pole. Okay, we're looking down onto the North Pole, and our ship is going east, which is to the left. You should get used to it. This is your default view that you're mostly going to look at for your orbits. You're going to look down onto the North Pole, and we're looking to enter orbit counterclockwise. Okay, we're taking off to the left, or we're rotating in a counterclockwise direction. We took off somewhere over here. We are now here, and this is the highest point that we're going to reach right now. And we want to check what the height of this highest point is, and we're going to find that out by mousing over AP. Okay, I can't do it now because this menu is open, but if we mouse over AP, we're going to find our highest point. How high do we want to go? We want to go so that the highest point in our path is above 70 kilometers. 70 kilometers is the height of the atmosphere. We can't be orbital if we're still in the air because the air will slow us down and bring us down to the ground. So we have to be above 70. So I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to mouse over. Oh, we are. We're well above 70. Ooh, that's not ideal. Apparently I spent a little too long talking. Okay, that's fine. The reason I'm sort of a little, not happy about this is because we have used extra fuel raising our apoapsis, the highest point in this arc. We have spent extra fuel raising this up. And this is fuel that we want to use to go sideways. We only need to be above 70. And we're at 95, so we spent extra fuel doing that. It's probably not the end of the world, but yeah. So I've just killed the gas, and we're just going to coast at this point. Literally just coasting. We're in the thin enough atmosphere. We're at 70. We're closing in on 70 kilometers over here. I think we can mouse over our ship as well. Yeah, so we can see our current altitude. The second we hit 70, we are going to be in space. Now, of course, we've done this before. So we are now in space, so there's no more air, so it doesn't matter where we're facing. But let's take a look how much fuel we've got left. I've got a fair amount of fuel left. Hopefully you do as well. Hey, if you did it better than I did, your apoapsis will be at something like maybe 75. You know, you get a little bit of a margin. That's okay. As long as it's over 70, you're good. If you sent this over 100, then it's a possibility if you spent a little bit too much fuel going up. Remember, a lot of our fuel has to be spent going sideways. Now, you might have an arc that's a little bit more sort of steep. That means you didn't go sideways enough, and that means it might be a little bit more work to circularize. Sometimes you end up in this stage and you have really a flat, shallow arc, and that's really sexy, because that means you're going to have to spend very little fuel circularizing. So remember our diagram? This circle, this arc, kind of, well, it's an ellipsis, not a circle, but it describes something that still goes inside the planet. And what we want to do is we want to, at this point here, we want to burn prograde to add more energy to our circle. We want to embiggen our circle so that it rounds itself out and in particular pokes out the other side of the planet, so we describe a nice round orbit. This is called circularizing. We want to do it at the apoapsis because remember, when you are adding energy to the system by burning prograde, what you're really doing is you're pushing the opposite side of the circle higher up. So if we were to burn prograde over here, what would happen? Well, we'd be pushing the opposite side of the circle, would be here up. And we could technically go into orbit by doing something like that, but the problem is you're pushing the opposite side of the circle up. Meanwhile, this bulge over here is going to look like this, which means your apoapsis is going to be high, which means we've actually spent a bunch of fuel raising the apoapsis and ending up with a really wonky non-circular orbit. The fact that it's not circular isn't actually a problem, except that it's not fuel efficient because we did way more work rising out the bulgy parts than we needed to. If you have a nice circular orbit, it means there's no bulge that represents wasted fuel. So the sweet spot to do it is at the apoapsis, which is the highest point in our current quote-unquote orbit, which is going to mean we're going to be raising what is currently the lowest point in our orbit up and end up with something as circular as possible. So we want to wait until we're as close to the apoapsis as possible, and then we want to burn prograde, which is this marker over here, the yellow circle with the two wings that come out of the side. Now, as we approach, so we can point to this prograde marker, but this prograde marker represents the direction we're moving in. And right now we're moving slightly up. When we get here, let me pause again because we're getting quite close. When we get here, we're going to be moving completely sideways. So your prograde marker is actually going to drift and change depending on what part of this arc you're in. Because obviously here, the prograde is pointing up. Here, the prograde is pointing down. So clearly the prograde marker moves around a bit. How do we do this? Well, most of your guides, and especially later when you get maneuver nodes, you can time this out properly. We need to dump a certain amount of energy into our quote-unquote orbit at the apoapsis so that the periapsis pops out the other side. And if we could, we would dump all that energy instantly. However, that's not actually possible with our engine design. As such, we're going to have to burn our engine for several seconds to get the job done. And ideally, we'd like to burn about half the time before the apoapsis and half the time afterwards, because all the math will work out to be super efficient. That's not really feasible in this particular situation because we're mostly going to be guessing. So I'm going to give you a cool rule of thumb. If you point prograde and then you light your engine, if the apoapsis starts to move away from you, that means you started your burn too early, and it means you're going to be spending too much energy raising your apoapsis as opposed to just circularizing. So if we start our burn and the apoapsis moves away from us, we are then going to stop the burn, wait another couple of seconds, and try again. So I'm going to start the burn. Apoapsis move, not too quickly, but it's definitely moving away from us, so I'm going to stop. And so instead of going to full burn, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold shift and just bring my throttle up slowly. And, oh, it's still moving away from us, so I'm just going to hit cancel and wait. Because it's more efficient if you avoid pushing the apoapsis away from you. Inevitably, at some point, it will move away, but that's going to be all right. So let's try this again. I'm just going to hold shift to slowly throttle up, And there we go. So we've sort of frozen. It doesn't look like the apoapsis is getting closer to us. It's not really getting away from us either. Maybe getting away from us a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to just turn, again, to make sure I'm facing more correctly. Prograde over here. And try to keep that in. The apoapsis is moving towards us, which is, I mean, is good. The only problem is it moving towards us too quickly? Because if it passes us and we still have a long way to go to circularize, it's not great. So I'm just going to throttle up and just kind of try to freeze it. There we go, about a fixed distance. Now shifting away from us. Again, it will move a little bit. That's not the end of the world. I'll throttle down a little, try to keep it there. Meanwhile, if we take a look at our path. Look at our path. What's happening? It's getting wider and wider and wider. And at some point, it's going to poke out the opposite side. And we'll actually see the periapsis marker. It'll say PE. There it is. And at some point, what's going to happen? See the apoapsis is moving away and the periapsis? At some point, they're going to want to swap. We're going to say stop right around there. They're going to swap because, of course, at some point, if we keep burning here and we keep pushing the opposite side up, at some point, inevitably, the opposite side of our orbit becomes the new highest point. So when these two are swapping, that should be when we are at about the most circular we can be. Let's check. Our apoapsis is now 105 kilometers, so we have pushed it up a little bit more, but I think we're okay. Meanwhile, our periapsis is at 90 kilometers. So it's not exactly circular, they're a little bit off, but that's pretty good. I mean, if you're just eyeballing that, that kind of looks like a circle to me. I think we can be relatively proud of that. And most importantly, the lowest point in our orbit, which is always the periapsis, is above 70. By being above 70, that means it's not in the atmosphere, which means we have achieved orbit. And we can actually verify that by checking our alerts over here. We can find out we've got a milestone that we entered orbit, and we've completed our contracts over here, getting a whole bunch of Kerbal bucks and some extra science as reward. Even though we didn't bring any science with us, we got some bonus science, which is great. Because this orbit does not touch the atmosphere, it is a stable orbit. Jebediah, in his little spaceship over here, will be in orbit around the planet forever, unless we do something. It so happens we have just a little bit of fuel left over. That's quite lucky for Jebediah. Otherwise, I hope he brought enough snacks, because he would not be coming home. But we have just a little bit of fuel left, and that's going to be all it takes for us to get Jebediah home. In fact, we won't even need this much fuel. How do we get Jebediah home? Well, your first instinct might be, hey, let's point the ship at the planet, which we can totally do. I mean, you can just eyeball it here and point the ship to the planet. At some point, okay, so you're pointing at the planet. See this blue marker over here with the arrows pointing in? It turns out this is the, I think it's called the anti-radial. Doesn't matter. This is the icon that says, hey, you're pointing at the thing that you're orbiting right now. And on the opposite side of the Navball, for example, there's a blue circle with the arrows pointing out. Hey, you're pointing away from the thing that you're orbiting. There happens to be two purple markers perpendicular to this as well. There's the normal and anti-normal, these pinkish purple markers, but we can ignore them for now. Now, technically, if you pointed towards the planet and burned, technically this would get you home, but not in a very efficient way. The radial and anti-radial burns, what they do, we can go into Photoshop for a second again. What they do is, let me go and do this. Whoops, come on. Do this, and then do this, so that we've got our orbit. If we were to go to burn radial or anti-radial, what you're doing is you're twisting your orbit around wherever you are. So again, we're here, okay? We are here. If we were to burn radial or anti-radial, you actually end up doing this. So if we burn towards the planet, yeah, we will go ahead and we will hit the planet somewhere over here. By burning towards the planet, we will hit the planet over here. But what you're really doing is you're just literally, you're pivoting your orbit around whatever point you're at, which is kind of a neat thing and is actually a tool you can use for various stuff, but isn't what we're looking to do right now, because moving your entire orbit over this way actually takes a fair amount of fuel. This is hard work to do that. Instead, the best way to come home is to do the opposite of what we just did. We just added energy into the system to raise the opposite side of our orbit. If we take energy away from the system, it'll shrink the circle and lower the opposite side of the orbit. And as it turns out, these movements here, they really take very little fuel to do this. So we want to shrink the circle until the lowest point of our orbit is within the atmosphere. Because if that happens, that means that at some point we're going to hit the air, it's going to slow us down. And if this point in our circle is, say, even like 30 kilometers above the surface. So it's not even touching the ground. But even at 30 kilometers above the surface, we're going to be hitting we're going to enter the atmosphere probably somewhere around here, hit some air, slow down. We'll actually end up landing somewhere here in the end, just because of how much the air slows us down. So we don't have to have the circle go inside the planet. We just have to have it go inside the atmosphere. So that's going to be our goal. And as it turns out, this is a really cheap thing to do fuel-wise. Now, where do we want to do this? The most efficient thing to do, if we want to lower our orbit, right? We want to make sure that our orbit is low enough that it's inside the atmosphere. So then it makes sense that we should lower the already lowest part of our orbit, right? If our orbit looked like this, we would not want to lower this part down to here, because look at all the distance. That would be inefficient. Instead, in this situation, it would be much better if we lowered this part over here down, because it would take a lot less work to lower this already low part to slightly lower. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take the lowest part in our orbit and drop it down until it's within the atmosphere. And the lowest part of our orbit is always opposite the highest part of our orbit, so we want to be at the apoapsis, and we want to burn retrograde to shrink our circle. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we take a look at where we are, the lowest point in our orbit is the periapsis. That's what we want to drop. So at the opposite point of our orbit, we want to go and remove energy, remove velocity from our orbit so that our orbit shrinks, and it will shrink, will be anchored over here. You sort of never change where you are, right? By making a burn, by lighting your engines, you don't change where you are now. You just change where you're going to be in the future. So we're going to go at the apoapsis. We're going to burn retrograde. So we're going to find the retrograde marker, which is the yellowish, greenish circle with the downwards wings, because we're slowing down. So if we do this, we are now facing in the opposite direction of movement. You can see that, right? We're moving that way. You can see by the Kerbal beneath us, and we're pointing away from that. So our engine is pointing in the direction that we are facing, which means if we light the engine, we're going to be slowing down. And we're just going to wait until we reach the apoapsis. Now, I'm going to do a little time warp here because I'm impatient. Before you time warp, you should really quick save. I'm going to hit F5 to quick save, because it's very easy to accidentally time warp too long and have everything go bonkers. So then if that happens, you can hold the F9 key down to reload from your quick save. So I'm just going to go ahead and time warp a little bit. So I'm hitting the period key to accelerate time, and then when we get closer to the apoapsis, I'm going to hit the comma key to slow down the time warp. So that just sped things up if you're impatient like me. So I'm going to call that close enough to the apoapsis. We're not going to be exact, that's okay. I'm going to open up the Navball frame. I'm once again going to go and just turn so that we are facing exactly retrograde. And then I'm going to light the engine, and it's going to be dropping the opposite side of our orbit. And all we care about, if you right click on this, it'll stay open, so you don't have to worry about leaving your mouse there. All we want that to do is to drop, so it's less than 70. Less than 70 means we'll hit the air, we'll come home at some point. In practice, put it between 30 and 20, right? 20 to 30, that's going to be a good range to guarantee that you hit some good thick air and you slow down in sort of an attractive fashion. So retrograde, and I'm going to hit Z to accelerate. Whoa, that's really fast, actually. I'm just going to hit a few shifts and wait for that to come down. There we go. 23 kilometers sounds great. Now, we could keep burning retrograde here. I mean, we used like a thimble of fuel. It was really cheap. We could burn the rest of our fuel, bring our periapsis down lower, but we don't want to. And the reason is this: while it would be perfectly fine if we dropped it to the point where our path intersected Kerbal, over here, and like actually hit the ground over here, there's no reason to do it. When we did in the last video for our return, we wanted to come through with as much air as possible between us and the ground. This ensures lots of air between us and the ground. We're still going to land, but this gives us maximum air. That's not as important for the return from this orbit here, because we're not actually going that fast. Well, we're going at 21,000 or 2,100 meters per second here. But if we're coming back from the moon, or even from outside of the local system here, like you come back from another planet, you'll be coming back really, really, really fast, and you really want a lot of air between you and the ground, so this tends to be how you return. The funny thing is, despite the fact that this is the lowest point in our orbit, it is very likely that we will land maybe here, maybe even in the ocean over here, because again, we're going to be hitting the air here and slowing down. So we're inevitably going to be re-entering the atmosphere. Our altitude is dropping here. We don't need these fuel tanks anymore. We don't want them to burn up and explode and kill us. So we're going to go ahead and hit spacebar to stage, like that. Once again, I'm going to go in time warp by hitting the period key on the keyboard. I'm going to time warp like all the way to times 50, which is our limit right now. As soon as we enter the atmosphere, it will automatically cancel time warp for us. There it is. What I want to make sure to do now is to point our heat shield into the air. And we do that if we want to place our butt into the direction we're moving in. That means we need to face retrograde. Retrograde means our nose is facing away from our direction of movement, or our butt is facing into the direction of movement, which means the hot air that we're soon going to be hitting is going to be hitting our heat shield. Because the shape is actually aerodynamically stable, we can actually toggle off the SAS, and it should automatically keep us facing retrograde. There'll be a little bit of wobble at first here because it's quite thin air, so it has a hard time locking in super hard, but as we get into thicker and thicker air, it'll really steady up in that orientation. If your center of mass is a little bit off, if you have some extra bits and bobs on here that might be adding wonky aerodynamic drag, you might be forced to leave SAS on and just manually keep yourself facing retrograde, because your ship might want to, might drift away from it just uncontrollably. But here we're good. Turning off the SAS, I'm just going to go ahead and time warp. Again, you should quick save before you time warp, but we've got one not that far away, so we're going to go ahead and just let this capsule return in. And if we hit M to go to the map, we can actually see our periapsis dropping over here because we're being slowed down by the air. It's dropping, it's dropping, it's dropping. It's now inside the planet, and we're going to keep seeing the path. And again, I suspect we'll probably end up landing maybe in the ocean at this point, actually. Even though our lowest point was over here, we're just being slowed down so much by the air. Yeah, we're definitely going to splash down in the water, and that's fine. So, flame effects are going on, speed is being burned off, our heat shield, our blader is being burned off. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. It lets itself burn away so that the heat doesn't accumulate in the pod, but at some point, probably quite soon, we're going to stop seeing heat effects. If we keep an eye on our parachute, it's red right now, which means it would be dangerous to open up the parachute. It'll turn yellow for a moment when it's risky, and then it'll turn, there we go, white when it is perfectly fine for you to open your parachute. I'm going to wait a little bit longer because it'll take us a long time to actually hit the water if we open the parachute now. I'm going to say now is going to be fine, so we're going to do that. The parachute does not fully deploy until you're under 1,000 meters from the surface, which is now. Excellent. And I'm going to go ahead and cancel the time warp. And there we go. Now we're going to land at a nice gentle 6 meters per second. That is actually fine. But if for some reason you're ever descending and it's slightly too fast, you're worried you might hit a little too hard, one of the things you can do is shed a little bit of extra weight here. If you right click on the heat shield, you can jettison the heat shield. We don't need it anymore, and it's just heavy. So the parachute is, you know, being pulled down a little bit harder. So if we go and jettison the heat shield, you can see our surface speed now drops quite a bit. So instead of dropping or landing around 6 meters per second, we drop at about 5 meters per second. So Jebediah is going to be slightly more comfortable. I'm going to go ahead and time warp again. And there we go. Splash down. Boom! And just like that, we have returned home from orbit. We can recover our vessel, and congratulations, you have just achieved one of the most difficult things to do as a newcomer to Kerbal Space Program. Orbit is not easy. Oh, we get some bonus science for returning from orbit. Even though we ran no science experiments, we actually got a fair bit in there. Hey, it's nighttime. By the way, if you're not happy with the time of day, you can use the time warp controls over here. You can also use this handy dandy button to warp to the next morning, which is quite nice. There we go, in case you don't like launching in the darkness. So what next? Next for you would be to go to the moon. Almost certainly there's going to be a contract here to explore the moon. This contract simply requires you to do a flyby of the moon. Not landing, just fly by it. This is not going to be covered by this tutorial system over here. Maybe in the future I'll make a follow-up video for the moon, but in practice, if you follow any of the Let's Plays at this point, you should be able to follow along it. You will get great instructions for how to do a flyby of the moon, in fact, landings of the moon, and so on and so forth. Feel free to explore these different contracts at this point to try to raise some money, and if the contracts seem kind of poopy, then go ahead and feel free to decline a contract, and you should get a new list of contracts from time to time as you do things. So again, testing the Hammer solid fuel booster while orbiting Kerbal, this would be quite tricky. It does offer a lot of money, but we'd be hard. We're going to decline that, and instead, some new contracts kind of come in. This is a good way to raise money. If you need more science, then again, you can do science at any different biomes. Each one of these locations at the Kerbal Space Program counts as a different biome. If you go and unlock some wheels, which happens first at aviation over here, you can make yourself kind of a little car, right? Just a fuel tank, an engine, and some wheels, and all of a sudden you've got a car that you can drive around on the surface of Kerbin, and you stick some science experiments on there and then drive it around the Kerbal Space Center. Keep in mind, cars are a really good way to kill your Kerbals because it's really easy to go too fast and flip them over. So do be a little careful with your driving, and also go ahead and make liberal use of the quick save over here. So money will let you upgrade your stations. Science will let you unlock more parts. And I don't know. I think that's it for this really simple little tutorial. Hopefully you found it of good value. And again, you can find more activities by watching Let's Plays, which I feel that you have all the tools to do that at this point. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you next time.